people, pay attention here because the story I'm going to tell isn't just about faith and courage. It's about physics, medicine, and how the most unlikely person can turn the tables when they understand the enemy. It's the story of David and Goliath, but seen from the perspective of someone who was there, paying attention to the details. The scene starts in the Valley of Elah. Imagine the heat. Imagine the endless dust. On one side of the valley, the army of Israel, led by King Saul. On the other, the Philistines, tough folks who weren't there to play around. Two armies standing still, staring each other down, in a tension you could cut with a dull knife. No one wanted to be the first to go down into the valley because whoever went down would die. And why all this fear? Because of him, Goliath. You needed to see Goliath. He wasn't just a big man, he was a freak of nature. When he stepped out from the Philistine line and descended the hill, the ground truly shook. He must have been about 3 meters tall, easily. His armor, according to reports, weighed more than a small car. It was pure bronze, covering his body from head to toe, and he carried it like it was a light coat. But here's where we start stripping away the legend and adding science. Goliath wasn't a superhuman, he was a sick man. That uncontrolled growth, that unbelievable height, didn't come from a protein-rich diet. Goliath probably suffered from what we now call acromegaly, or giantism. It's a condition where the body produces too much growth hormone, non-stop. The person doesn't stop growing, and that comes at a high price.
Think about it. When you grow too fast, your body becomes disproportionate. His head was enormous, his hands like shovels. And the worst part, folks, was his vision. The gland that causes all that growth is right near the optic nerve, inside the head. So Goliath, with all that imposing presence, was almost blind. He saw the world blurry, with little depth. He relied on hearing and noise to know where the enemy was. He was an easy target, yes, but you had to get close enough for him to sense you. And then it was over. And he knew it. That's why his tactic was always the same. He would descend into the valley, shout insults, challenge them. It was 40 days of psychological torture. He bellowed, "Send a man. If he defeats me, we'll be your slaves. If I win, you'll be ours." No one in Israel moved. The army was paralyzed. Saul, the king, was a tall and strong man, but next to Goliath, he looked like a child. The fear was palpable. It smelled of sweat and despair. And it's in this scenario that our protagonist enters, David. David wasn't a soldier. David was a boy, a shepherd. He came from Bethlehem, a little town of no importance. He was far from being the oldest son, far from being the strongest. He had sunburnt skin, smelled of wool and grass. He was sent to the battlefield with a simple mission: deliver cheese and bread to his older brothers who were serving in Saul's army. He must have been about 17 years old, at most, a kid. When David arrived, it was chaos. He left the provisions with the person in charge and ran to the front line, curious. And that's where he heard it, Goliath's shout, that roar that seemed to come from the center of the earth. David saw the scene, the giant descending, insulting the God of Israel, insulting the army, and everyone fleeing and trembling.
David's brothers were furious. "What are you doing here, kid? Go take care of your sheep. You came here just to watch the war, didn't you?" But David wasn't looking at the war. He was looking at the giant, and he wasn't afraid. He was, in fact, calculating. David was a shepherd, and being a shepherd back then wasn't just sitting under a tree playing the flute. It was dangerous work. The region was full of lions and bears that came down from the mountains to steal sheep. David didn't have a sword or a spear to defend the flock. He had a much more efficient weapon for what he did, the sling. Folks, the sling isn't a rubber slingshot. Forget that image. The sling was made of braided leather. You placed a smooth stone, the size of an egg, in the leather pouch and started spinning it. You spun, and when you released one end of the leather, the stone flew out at an unbelievable speed. Think of a bullet. Think of a ballistic projectile. Shepherds were trained from a young age to use the sling with surgical precision. They could hit a bird in mid-flight. They could, and David had already proven it, kill a lion or a bear with a well-placed shot to the head. And David, seeing Goliath, didn't see an invincible monster.
He saw a large, slow target with poor vision and a critical flaw in his armor. Pay attention to this detail. Goliath wore armor that covered everything except his forehead. Why? Because he needed to see minimally. The bronze helmet left a small opening right above the eyes, where the skin and bone were most vulnerable. The giant trusted that no one would be crazy enough to get close, and even if they tried, he'd crush them before they could raise the sword. But David didn't need to get close. David had range. When David heard the king's promises that whoever killed the giant would become rich and marry Saul's daughter, he didn't think twice. He stepped forward. "I'll fight this Philistine," he said.
Saul, the king, nearly fell backward. "You're a boy, David. He's been a warrior since his youth." David, with the calm of someone who'd already faced bigger beasts, explained his experience. He said, "I tend my father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and took a sheep, I'd go after it, attack it, and rescue the sheep from its mouth. And if it turned on me, I'd grab it by the beard and kill it. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God." David's reasoning was purely practical. He'd already faced predators faster and smarter than a sick giant. Saul, desperate, gave in. "Go, and may the Lord be with you." The king tried to dress David in his own armor. Imagine the scene. King Saul's heavy bronze armor hanging on a skinny kid. David tried to walk but couldn't. He wasn't used to it. That armor was useless to him. It would only slow him down and take away his agility, which was his greatest weapon. "I can't fight in this," he said. "I'm not used to it." David removed the armor, took his shepherd's staff, and most importantly, his sling. He went down to the brook that ran through the valley and searched. He didn't pick just any stones. He picked 5 smooth stones, stream stones, perfectly rounded and polished by the water. Why smooth? Because a smooth stone flies faster, has less air resistance, and when it hits, it transfers all the kinetic energy to the target without waste. It was pure aerodynamics, without him knowing the name for it. With the 5 stones in his pouch, David began walking towards the valley, towards Goliath, who was already waiting there.
Goliath saw the boy approaching and let out a laugh that echoed through the mountains. A mocking, scornful laugh. "Am I a dog that you come at me with a stick and stones?" Goliath bellowed. He was furious. For a warrior of his caliber, being challenged by a shepherd boy was the greatest insult. He'd expected a general, a champion, a man in full armor. Instead, a kid came. Goliath began cursing David by his gods. He said, "Come here, and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field." But David didn't stop. He kept approaching. And at this point, the audience from both armies was in absolute silence, waiting for the massacre. David's response, however, gave him the psychological edge. He didn't shout back about Israel's power. He made a tactical analysis. "You come against me with sword and spear and shield," David shouted, keeping the exact distance where Goliath's spear couldn't reach him. "But I come against you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." At this moment, the crucial difference between the two became clear. Goliath was armed for hand-to-hand combat. He was a destruction machine at close range. He had a shield bearer walking in front of him, protecting him from arrows and distant attacks. But David wasn't using a military weapon. He was using a hunting weapon, designed for speed and precision. Goliath, seeing the boy continuing to approach but keeping his distance, began to move. And here again, his illness was the problem. The giant was slow. He had to turn his whole body to change direction. His steps were heavy and predictable. David, however, was fast. He could run, change direction, and most importantly, he knew exactly what speed he needed to move at to prevent Goliath's shield bearer from aligning to protect him. Goliath began walking clumsily toward David. He trusted that even with poor vision, he'd sense the boy's presence and crush him before he could do anything. But David didn't give him time for that. He ran toward the giant, running toward danger. It seems crazy, but it was the perfect tactic. By running, David forced Goliath to react, and the giant's reaction would be slow and ineffective. As he ran, David's hand was already in the leather pouch, grabbing the first stone. He swung his arm, started whirling the sling above his head. The sound of the leather cutting through the air was a high-pitched whine that the silent crowd could hear. The stone was gaining speed, a lot of speed. And David, who had spent his whole life training to hit a small moving target, had a target that was, well, Goliath, gigantic. David's plan wasn't to wound, it wasn't to disarm. David's plan, based on his experience as a hunter, was one thing: immediate knockout. He knew where the armor failed, the forehead. He knew that even with a thick skull, the impact of a stone hitting at the speed of a revolver shot at a focal point would cause instant brain damage. Goliath, now at a critical distance, raised his spear, ready for the final blow. He just needed one more step. But David released the sling. The perfectly smooth stone shot out from the leather strap. It didn't arc. It made a straight line, a deadly projectile. It traveled through the air at a speed that scientists today estimate at about 100 to 150 kilometers per hour. Not the speed of a modern bullet, but more than enough to penetrate soft tissue and cause severe trauma. The target was there, large and slow. The impact was dry. The stone hit Goliath exactly where David wanted, on the forehead, in the only unprotected part of the head.
What happened next wasn't a fight, it was a collapse. The kinetic energy of the stone, concentrated at that point, made Goliath, with all his mass, fall face first. It wasn't a stumble. It was like someone had turned off the power. He crashed to the ground with a boom that raised a cloud of dust and made the mountains echo. The giant, who was terrifying on his feet, was now just a heap of flesh and bronze, fallen, inert. It all happened in seconds. The silence that followed wasn't of fear anymore. It was of disbelief. The Philistine army couldn't understand. Their champion, their war god, was on the ground, dead or knocked out. David, with the calm of someone who just hit a target in practice, ran. He didn't need the second, third, or fourth stone. The job was done. He ran up to the fallen Goliath. The giant was unconscious, probably with a fatal concussion, or with the stone lodged in his skull. He had no way to defend himself. David, without a sword, looked at the giant. He saw the sword Goliath carried in its sheath, a massive weapon that David could barely lift. He drew it. And there, before both armies, David finished the job. He used Goliath's own weapon to cut off the giant's head. When Goliath's head rolled on the dusty ground, it was the end of the war. Not by military strategy, but by panic. The Philistine army, seeing their champion decapitated by a boy, didn't hesitate. They fled. David's victory wasn't a random miracle, folks. It was the result of cold analysis, intensive training with the sling, and knowledge of the enemy's weakness. David saw the giant not as a god, but as a target with a design flaw. And the autopsy of the giant, done right there in the valley, proved the point. Goliath's arrogance, combined with his illness, created the opening that a well-thrown stone needed. But the story doesn't stop there. What David did after that moment, and how this victory shaped his future, is what truly defines the legend.
The silence, my friends, lasted only an instant of absolute shock. But when Goliath, that mountain of flesh and bronze, collapsed with a boom that seemed like the end of the world, the silence shattered. It wasn't just one noise, it was an explosion of sounds. From the Philistine side, what was heard was pure panic. They couldn't believe it. Their champion, the reason for their confidence, the guy who guaranteed victory, was on the ground, dead. The legend broke. The fear they had imposed on Israel for 40 days now turned into terror for themselves. They didn't wait to see if Goliath would get up. They turned their backs and started running. Disorganized, tripping over each other, throwing shields and spears away to gain speed. They fled like scared rabbits. And the army of Israel? Folks. Saul's army, which moments before was paralyzed by terror, saw the miracle. They saw the giant fall. They saw the shepherd boy standing over the enemy. Suddenly, the courage hidden beneath the fear exploded. The shout that came from the Israelites' throats wasn't a prayer. It was a war cry of accumulated revenge. They descended the hill en masse, running toward the valley, and began the pursuit. They chased after the Philistines, who were already in desperate retreat. The battle, which seemed impossible, turned into a hunt. David, meanwhile, was there, calm, standing over the giant's body. The job was done. He had proven his point. But he knew he needed more than a body on the ground to secure the victory, and most importantly, to prove to everyone that the monster was truly defeated. He raised Goliath's sword. Imagine a heavy sword. David, skinny as he was, needed a huge effort to hold that gigantic weapon. He lifted the Philistine's bloody head and displayed it.
You need to understand the symbolism of that. It wasn't just a trophy. It was irrefutable proof of vulnerability. The terror that had existed in the valley of Elah was now there, decapitated, in the hands of a boy. The Israelites, seeing Goliath's head, gained even more strength, and the pursuit went all the way to the gates of the Philistine cities. It was a massacre. The war ended that day, not with a long siege, but with a single projectile. David, carrying the sword in the giant's head, returned to the camp. Imagine the scene. King Saul, who had been trembling behind his tent, had to face the boy. Saul looked at David, then at Goliath's head, and his mind must have tied itself in knots. That kid, whom he had barely recognized hours before, had done what his entire army and he himself hadn't had the courage to do. The first thing Saul asked, by the way, wasn't about the strategy, but about David's identity. Whose son is this young man? Saul had already made a public promise. Whoever killed the giant would gain great riches and marry his daughter. And Saul was a king. He couldn't go back on his word. From that day on, David's life changed forever. He was no longer the shepherd. He was the hero of Israel. He was the guy who had lifted the weight of fear from an entire nation's shoulders. But let's go back a bit to our main theme, which is the autopsy of this giant. Because David's victory wasn't just a moment of luck. It was the cold application of ballistic science and knowledge of the enemy's weakness. What we learn from analyzing the scene is that David exploited a flaw that was both medical and tactical.
First, the medical flaw. Goliath suffered from acromegaly, gigantism. As I said before, this disease causes the body to grow uncontrollably, but at a huge cost, especially to vision. Goliath's vision was tunnel-like, blurry. He had no depth perception. Think about it. A normal soldier, to fight, needs peripheral vision and quick reflexes. Goliath had to rely on slow, predictable movements and a shield bearer to guide him. When David ran toward him, Goliath couldn't calculate the speed or trajectory. He saw a blur approaching but couldn't focus. Second, the tactical flaw, the armor. Goliath's armor was his greatest defense, but also his greatest weight and limitation. For Goliath, the only threat was hand-to-hand combat. He was prepared to absorb sword and spear blows and crush the enemy. He was completely unprepared for a high-speed, long-range attack. And here comes the physics of the sling. The stone David used, a smooth, perfectly rounded streamstone, wasn't just any projectile. When David whirled that sling, he turned his arm's muscular force into pure speed. Modern studies have tried to replicate the force of a shepherd's sling. They found that a trained shooter could launch a projectile at speeds up to 150 kilometers per hour, and in some cases even more. The impact of a roughly 50-gram stone hitting at that speed is comparable to a low-velocity firearm projectile, like a .45 shot at close range. The released kinetic energy is massive. And where did David aim? He aimed at the only point the bronze armor didn't cover, the forehead, right above the eyes, at the center of the skull. The human skull is tough, but not invincible. When that stone hit Goliath's forehead, it didn't ricochet. It transferred all its energy to the frontal bone. The result was severe blunt trauma.
No matter how strong you are, if your brain suffers a shock of that level, the body simply shuts down. Goliath didn't have time to feel pain, didn't have time to react. He was knocked out instantly, falling like a log, and the fall alone could have been fatal. David didn't need brute force. He needed aim and speed. He used intelligence and his shepherd training to turn the enemy's greatest disadvantage, slowness and illness, into his greatest advantage. Think about it. David was a sniper, and Goliath was a large stationary target. Goliath's arrogance, the fact that he dismissed David's weapon, "Am I a dog that you come at me with a stick and stones?" sealed his fate. He didn't take the threat of a ranged attack seriously. He was focused only on giant combat. And David, who knew he couldn't fight toe-to-toe with sword and shield, didn't make the mistake of entering Goliath's game. He played his own game. He turned the combat arena into a hunting arena. David's victory, therefore, becomes a case study in military strategy and forensic medicine, centuries before these sciences were formalized. Goliath's body, left there in the valley, was proof that size isn't everything. His mass, which should have been his protection, became his weakness, making him slow and predictable. The armor, which protected him from swords, was useless against the sling's speed. David, the shepherd who became a hero that day, took Goliath's skull to Jerusalem, physical proof that he hadn't just defeated a man, but shattered a symbol of oppression. From that moment on, David's story is the story of the king he would become. He fulfilled Saul's promise, married the king's daughter, and entered the court. But he never forgot where he came from, nor the skills that saved him. He brought the field experience, the shepherd's cunning, to his life as a warrior, and eventually as a king.
What we take from this story, folks, isn't just the lesson of faith, which is important, of course. It's the lesson of preparation. It's the lesson that you have to know your weapon, and more importantly, know your enemy. David didn't fight the giant. He took him down. He used science, physics, and the precision of his training to fell the invincible. And the giant? Goliath the giant, with all his strength and bronze, became just proof that sometimes the best armor is a quick-thinking head, and the most powerful weapon is the one you master perfectly. And that's how, with a smooth stone and a sure shot, the shepherd became Israel's greatest king, and the giant just a target.